It gives me pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Burkell, who's an associate professor and assistant dean in research at the Faculty of Information and Media Services here at Western. Her research focuses on the social impact of technology, examining how technological mediation changes social interaction and information behavior. Her recent projects include an examination of online behavioral tracking on consumer health information sites and research on privacy expectations and practices on online social networks. These projects have been funded through the contributions of the Office of the Privacy Commission of Ontario. She is also the principal investigator in graphics, animations, and new media, where she does research on privacy and new media environments and leads a working group on online news production, dissemination, and interpretation. Please welcome Dr. Burkell.
Okay. Thanks so much for coming out. And it's such a pleasure to come and talk to a room full of an enthusiastic audience. So often as we're teaching our classes, I have a very different experience. So thanks so much for coming. So the question, are we okay? Some feedback. The question that titles this talk today is, am I being followed? And I'll give you a preview. The answer is absolutely yes. Sorry, now I have to look at my tech person and see whether he wants me. Okay, good. All right, the answer is absolutely yes. Let me see whether, I have an audio clip in this slide that my son put together for me that's never worked, but it might work today, so let's see. Oh. No. Oh, okay. Living with online surveillance, because that is the reality of our lives. So, there we go. The question, am I being followed? The answer for me is absolutely yes. In fact, I enjoy a glass of red wine from time to time, and sometimes when I'm enjoying my glass of red wine, things will happen and glasses will get broken. And recently, we reached the last of our Rydell O glasses that we really liked, and so I went online and I started looking for them. And I went on Google and I Googled Rydell O wine glasses, and Google helpfully returned to me a number of sites where I could purchase those glasses, and I went on to do so. But what fascinated me, and it's a bit weird, is that after that, those Rydell wine glasses showed up when I went looking for books on Amazon. Amazon helpfully tells me all the books I might be interested in, but Amazon also that day helpfully told me where I could buy Rydell wine glasses from them. And not only that, when I went back to Google sometime later after having purchased the glasses, I was done with them, there they were again on the sidebar. Now, you may or may not have had this experience with wine glasses, but I bet you've had this experience. Perhaps for you, as it was for me, some time ago, I have a clawfoot tub in my bathroom. I was looking for a rack for it. That rack followed me around for months. Maybe for you, it's a putter. Or as it was for some particular Canadian man who we'll get to later, who eventually complained to the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, it could be a CPAP machine. But the reality is, for most of us, if we spend any time online doing anything and we start paying attention to the environment that is around us, the online environment, what we're going to notice is that we are followed. That the environment around us, the online environment that we experience, changes in reaction to and in relation to the activities that we carry out. And it doesn't just change locally in time and locally in virtual space. It changes across our experience over time and as we move throughout the internet. Now, we've thought about surveillance for a very long time. There's Jeremy Bentham's notion of the panopticon, where you have a large number of cells that are open to view by a central guard. And one of the fundamentally important things about the panopticon is that people don't know if they're being watched, and it becomes a very powerful method of behavioral control. There's the notion that came out in the Minority Report of precogs, where we imagined that you could not only survey current activities, but that you could survey something about intentions. And act on the basis of that. Now, we haven't come there, but one isn't certain we won't. Snowden brought the idea of surveillance, this kind of ubiquitous, constant surveillance, right down to today, and to actions of our own government in addition to those of other governments. So here we have various notions of surveillance, all of which reveal different kinds and different levels of personal information. When you think about personal information as kind of an iceberg, there's the stuff you know about, and there's the stuff you don't know about, which is the majority, or maybe you're not so aware of, which is the majority of actually what is known about us and what is revealed about us. I want to talk about that iceberg of personal or private information as we experience it, as we reveal it, as it is known about us in the online context. So I want to start with the tip of the iceberg. What do I mean by the tip of the iceberg? Well, as you travel around the net, you reveal and choose to reveal information for various purposes. You reveal information to Indigo when you go online and you search for a book. You know that you're doing this. You reveal information when you make a purchase from them. And why do you do that? I'm so sorry. Is there another mic on? I won't go over there. You reveal personal information, financial information in order to complete the transaction. You reveal information whenever you sign up for membership for a site. You do this intentionally. You're aware that you're doing it. You reveal information. If any of you are members of any social network, and I'm to tell you if I was talking to my class of undergraduates, all of them would be, unless they've moved on to the latest thing. But we reveal a great deal of information about our relationships, about our personal lives, about our desires, about our wishes, about our activities in our online social interactions. But that's not all we reveal. That's only what we know we're revealing, what's obvious, what the revelations that are obvious. I can't, just so you know, without my glasses on, I can't see you, so you have to wave at me if I need to do something different. Okay. There's this invisible collection. What do I mean? An invisible and actually automated collection of data. There's a collection of personal information that happens all the time. And it is a collection of information that we might call transactional. It's quite important. What I mean by transactional information is it's details about the stuff that we do online, the interactions, the activities that we undertake. And in little tiny pieces, I entered this search string, I visited this website. That information is integrated over multiple visits to websites and over multiple websites. So it's not just little tiny pieces of information that are all separate from one another. Instead, many of them are linked together. It's linked by people who know, or by entities that know a lot more about us, to information that we explicitly provide, so it doesn't sit on its own. It supports strong statistical inferences that reveal additional information about us. So it's this shadow kind of picture. I think of it as being, and I think it's a good characterization, there's all this talk about big data, right? And I think big data is often and appropriately construed of little pieces of separate information about large communities of people that we integrate together in order to understand patterns across populations. That's, for example, how Google was for some time able to do a great job of tracking flu outbreaks, because they could integrate the searches of all kinds of people and find out that in this particular region of Canada, people were suddenly doing searches related to symptoms of the flu. But that's information integrated over people. There's also a big data. You yourself are a source of big data, and that big data is about you. The reason I call it big data is because it's a vast collection of small bits of information about you and your online, and indeed sometimes your offline activities, all of which can be mined in order to understand more about who you are, what you do, what you want, what you might purchase. Okay, so let's go back to that iceberg. The stuff that we are most aware of and most perhaps concerned about revealing, the stuff that's top of mind and has been in privacy protection regimes since online information was introduced, is what's called personally identifiable information. We're pretty good at dealing with this. The legal regimes were developed to deal with this. We understood from the beginning that we needed to protect people with respect to their personally identifiable information. And what do I mean by that? I mean things, and at law, we mean things like name, address, telephone number, email, stuff that can point directly and individually to you, stuff that is connected in an identifiable way to you. The Privacy Act in Canada and PIPEDA, and actually other privacy regulations like MFIPA and HIPAA, all anticipated and responded to risks that are associated with personally identifiable information. And these are just the Canadian regimes. In fact, internationally, in pretty much every jurisdiction, we've done a good job at protecting with respect to this information. And in fact, all of the existing regimes pretty much are based on what are called fair information practice principles developed in the 1970s, maybe by the OECD, maybe by the US government. It's never really clear. But those fair information practice principles include a number of guidelines for how personal information should be treated, primary among which are the idea that when your personal information is collected, you should be told that it's happening. That is, there's a principle of notice or awareness, and that you should have a choice in your consent, implicit or explicit, should be required for the collection of this personal information, because we recognize that it's yours and that the collection and use of that information has consequences, potential consequences for you. So when you hit a website, where does all this happen? Well, way down there at the bottom, in tiny, tiny print, there's often something called a privacy policy. Sometimes it's called terms of service. There are times when terms of service are relevant. But if you click on those unreadable privacy policies, you will find, or should find, buried in there, a disclosure of what personal information is collected, personally identifiable information, who that information is shared with, how that information is used, and while you are supposed to have the option to consent, typically what consent is implied. That is, your visiting of the website or use of the services on that website constitutes your consent. So they satisfy the legal requirements. These things are often difficult to read. They're difficult to understand. They're to satisfy the legal requirements and regulatory requirements rather than to educate you, but at least you know that the information is there. That's the tip of the iceberg. But what's that stuff, that huge amount of stuff that's underneath? Like every iceberg, most of it is below the waterline. Well, what's below the waterline in terms of personal information is what's called non-personally identifiable information. So this has been a problem in the legal and regulatory regime because we don't know how to deal with information that is yours but that doesn't identify you, that is about you but ostensibly can't be linked back to you. What do I mean? Well, in the context of online searches, I mean things like search strings, that is, what did you enter when you were searching, web pages that you visited, the date that you visit those pages, the time that you visit those pages. Your activities online are certainly about you. We'd all agree, right? That's my data. That's my information. That's information about me. But if it's completely separated from me, if it is unlinked to me and my identity, then it is not personally identifiable information, and it doesn't automatically get protection under regulatory frameworks or law. And indeed, the Fair Information Practice Principles didn't anticipate this kind of information. This is what I'm calling transactional data. There are other forms of NPII, but I'm going to just talk, it's easier just to talk about because most of it is, this notion of transactional data. What do I mean? A transaction is I go online, I enter a search string. Google archives that. Google records my IP address, what the search string is I entered. They may record what I did on the basis of that, what websites I visited. It's a time when I visited a website with a date and timestamp and the identity of the website, and perhaps the referring site included. So it's that kind of information about online actions. Typically, NPII, and here's the crux of the problem, is tied to the device or indeed a piece of software within the device, so a browser that you're using on your laptop, and not to the person. That's why it didn't automatically get this kind of legal and regulatory protection, because it's information that is linked to the device that you're using or the piece of software that you're using on the device, and not to you. Now, increasingly, as our devices become more and more personal, there's a blurred line here. My phone is my phone. And we'll come back to this in a second, if you track my phone, to a very large extent, you're also tracking me. So there's a bit of an artificial dividing line between information tied to the device and information tied to the person. It is information that is about you, fundamentally about you, fundamentally about your activities, fundamentally about you as an individual, but it doesn't identify you. It can't point to you. By knowing the search string that I entered at a time and a place, you can't, someone who has that piece of information, can't go back and find me. Is this covered under the Privacy Act and under PIPEDA and under other regulatory frameworks? Well, there is some question about this. What we ask is, first of all, is it identifying? Now, the argument originally is absolutely it's not identifying. The big debate right now is about IP address. So the IP address is the number that's assigned to your device when you go on the net. Originally, IP addresses were not considered personally identifiable information, but an IP address reveals things like, it reveals some things about geographic location. It certainly reveals something about how you get your IP address, what kind of service you're using in order to access the net. And if that service provider keeps a record of IP addresses and where they're assigned and when they're assigned, as they do, then that information can identify you. So where we've come to is to understand that IP addresses are identifying, and now under PIPEDA and actually under the Privacy Act, we protect them. But this still isn't without, it's still not clean, okay? And one of the times when we ought to have been most aware of the fact that it's not clean and we're not entirely protected comes back again to Edward Snowden and his revelation about the activities of CSEC. And I don't know if you remember this, maybe you do, but there was a big deal made about the fact that CSEC, a Canadian agency, was tracking, and this is the term that was used, people who were using free Wi-Fi in airports. So what was happening? Well, you went on, you logged on to the free Wi-Fi, and they recorded non-identifying information about your device and what they call envelope information about your transactions. So that would be potentially where you sent an email to, not the content of the email. What phone number was called, but not the content of the call. So they make a distinction between metadata or envelope information, the outer wrapping. You can think of this being the same as a letter that comes to you, the contents are private, but arguably the envelope is not private, what's on the front of it. So they consider this metadata as envelope information. And the position of CSEC is that the spy agency is not tracking Canadians. However, privacy advocates, because they didn't collect the content of emails or the records of phone calls, so they did not actually collect what was being transacted. However, they did collect metadata like the device ID and potentially addresses of where emails were going. And once they had the device ID, they could track that device forward and backward in time, because what they did was then they went to all sorts of other free Wi-Fi networks and said, did you see this device? And lo and behold, you find out that I logged on at the airport on January 16th, and on January 17th, that same device showed up at a hotspot at Starbucks, maybe. So you could track my device forward and backward in time, and again, that realistically means at this point in time you track me. CSEC claims that it's legally authorized to collect metadata because it's not identifying information, but privacy advocates would strongly disagree, and they would say, I can't see any circumstances under which this would not be unlawful. It's under debate. There's a real back and forth about whether this information, which I feel can be linked to me, you may feel the same way, you may not, it can be legally collected, and I think a real responsibility for us as citizens to understand what it means if we say yes, usually under the auspices of some kind of security argument, or no to the collection and use of this kind of information by government agencies and or by commercial entities. Okay, so how does the Privacy Commissioner or anybody else involved in regulation go about deciding if something is personally identifiable? Well, I said first, you ask the question of, can it be linked to me? Another question that they ask is it personal or is it sensitive? Now I want to come back to the CPAP guy because this is kind of an interesting situation. Google allows advertisers, as a matter of fact, Google is an advertiser, and Google looks at the content of your searches and on the basis of that will target ads to you. That's why I ended up with those Rydell O glasses following me around. Google has committed in its terms of service not to deliver or target ads on the basis of personal sensitive information, which includes healthcare information. However, Google says that they do not control the activities of the advertisers who advertise on their site. So this gentleman went on and he searched for CPAP machines, and lo and behold, he found that CPAP machines were following him around the net. I didn't like this, and he complained to the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada reviewed the situation and tested for themselves what would happen if they did similar kinds of searches on what they considered to be healthcare information. And they found, as he did, that that information was being used to target ads in contravention, according to them, of Google's own policies. So they went to Google. The reach of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada can extend beyond our borders. Google is an American organization that we can extend beyond our borders and we can have some impact on their practices. Google said, yep, in fact, you're right. We are targeting on the basis of healthcare information. We agree that this is outside the bounds of what we agreed to in our terms of service. We're sorry that we can't control the activities of our advertisers. And they responded, and that sounds really good because I don't really want them to be tracking information about what I do in terms of healthcare searches. But here's the kicker. Google's response was to say, okay, so now what we're going to do is when we record your search information, we're going to look to see if it's a search for a CPAP machine. And if it is, we won't track it. Now that leaves me a bit troubled because that means, fair game is still any other health-related issue. You pick one, and apparently it's not on their keyword list that they're going to eliminate. So this is not a general solution to the problem, but it is good news in that in this specific case, an activist won. Okay, oh, there, I'm finished. There he's. Okay, so the question is also asked, can it be linked to personal information? That's why IP address kind of gets protected now because it can be linked to information about you. The other big question that's coming up now is it re-identifiable? This is huge. So let me give the example of tracking a device over time. So you have some access to, or somebody has access to the location information on my cell phone, let's say, and they track the location of my cell phone, and we have empirical data on this over a relatively short period of time. Let's give them a week where they can get hourly updates on where my phone is. Maybe we'll give them 2 weeks. It turns out that with a very high degree of accuracy, given location information of my phone for a relatively short amount of time, you can not only predict where I'm going to be at any given time, but you can very quickly identify me. My phone shows up in my office and in the Building for Information and Media Studies. It shows up at my house. It shows up as I'm traveling between those two locations. It shows up in the classroom I teach in on Monday mornings. And once you've got that, you pretty much have me. You know, it's easy to figure out who has that pattern of activities. So to argue that that is not re-identifiable is actually kind of crazy. Of course it's re-identifiable. As our statistical techniques become more and more sophisticated, the ability of people to aggregate this kind of data and re-identify is becoming stronger and stronger. So the sphere of what we ought to consider as personally identifiable information is actually increasing. So the bottom line is MPII might be protected, but it will not always be protected. We'll get protection under certain circumstances, and we will get protection if we push. So the debate between CSEC and the privacy advocates about the collection of metadata, it's a tough one. You know, we didn't just automatically win by saying we consider that to be personally identifiable. And look, I guess I use the language of win. I'm not saying that CSEC necessarily should not be allowed to collect that information. What I'm saying is that we should understand what we are allowing. Okay. Is So you can think of this as a creation of a very, very detailed digital shadow. You can think of your online transactional information as giving a very detailed picture of who you are, what you do, where you go, what your interests are, what your desires are, what your expectations are, what your plans are, who your relationships are with. If you take all of this information and you put it together, it's a pretty detailed picture of you. So what's good about that? Because this is not the collection and use of this kind of information is not universally a negative. Well, the big good is personalization. The reason that I can go on to Amazon and it will suggest to me books that usually I find kind of interesting. Why? Because they know who I am and what I've done in the past. The reason I can go back to a website that I regularly visit and it will flag me and say, hey, here's something new you haven't seen. Why? Because they're collecting NPII transactional information on me. You would be shocked at how much of your experience in the online environment is shaped around this kind of transactional information. Go online, try this, go online and do a search for something like, what's something I did recently? Search for something like Staples store. And what will happen is it will return to you links that are related to your geographic position. Very different from what you'd get if you did the same search out in BC. Why? Because it knows if you said Staples store, you're looking for a local one and it knows where you are. That stuff is seamless and invisible to us. We come to depend on it. It's a positive of the kind of personalization that we're talking about. There's stuff that's okay. I think of it as being okay. I worry a little bit about its invisibility. My son is 13. And like most 13-year-old boys, he has a set of interests that are quite distinct from mine. If we go online and enter the same search string, the results that are returned to him will be very vastly different from the results that are returned to me. Now that seems counterintuitive. We went online and we asked the same thing. But Google is saying, well, you're not really asking the same thing because you're two different people and we know a lot about your history of interest, where you've been, what you've done. And so we are going to shape the information environment that we deliver to you on the basis of what we know about you. Now, do I think this is necessarily a problem? No. And I can tell you my son is pissed off if I spend much time on his computer and he starts getting results that look like they would be targeted to me. And he's even more upset if the ads start looking like ones that would be targeted to me, because that's a big deal. So is it necessarily a problem? No. But I think it's something we should be aware of. Our information environments, the advertisements we see, the search results we get, are shaped by our online activities and what those providing information to us know about them. We can't be naive about this. We also need to be aware that much of what we do online that appears to be free to us. So Google, that's a fabulous service, right? And it is a service. There's incredible value that we get out of that. And we don't pay for it in dollars and cents. Now, let's not be naive. First of all, let's not be naive about how much it's worth to us. And let's not be naive about the fact that the provision of that service takes a great deal of time and energy and money. It's got to come from somewhere. So we're transacting. We're not giving money, typically. We are giving information and access to us for advertisers. It's a transaction. I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but we ought to be aware of it. Free services aren't free. Google Mail, I think most of you would probably know this, and if you don't, you should. Google Mail is a great mail service, and it's free. Except when you use Google Mail, you are allowing them, by the terms of service, to look at the content of your emails and to target advertisements to you on the basis of that content. Is it a good deal? That's up to you to decide. But it's the deal that you're making when you use that service. There is, however, potentially real ugly consequences of this. I worry about things like price discrimination. So if I go online and I do a search at midnight one night for dizziness, weakness, and loss of, I don't know, something that look like stroke symptoms. And I go and do that search on 5 different sites. And who knows why I'm doing it? Maybe because I'm experiencing those symptoms, maybe because my mother's experiencing those symptoms, maybe because I'm doing research for a paper, whatever. But if Google knows that I've done those searches and aggregates that information across multiple sites, which it's perfectly capable of doing, and then I turn around and I decide the next morning that I'm going on my trip to Mexico and I'm going to go on and buy to Blue Cross and buy some travel insurance, and suddenly Blue Cross is saying, whoa, this could be really expensive insurance. Why? I'm not saying they do get sold this information, but it's entirely possible that they would. And wouldn't Blue Cross like to know if I'm a person who appears to be concerned about strokes when they are deciding whether they're going to insure me and how much it's going to cost? Of course they would. The information is out there. It's likely to be used. Even denial of service. You need to think about, what's the government going to know about me and what I do and where I go? Am I okay with that? I think potentially there are very, very negative consequences of this kind of behavioral tracking. All right, so let's talk about how. How does it happen? Because it seems kind of mysterious. It certainly does to me. So websites, when you visit a website, it records non-personally identifiable information that's visible to them. What does it know? It knows your IP address. It knows how you got to the site. It can know things like the browser you're running. It knows what you do on the site. It knows the date and the time. It records that stuff. And your computer helpfully stores that information for it. So the website says, here's my special, it creates a special locker. It's a cookie, it's a little text file. Creates a special locker that only it has the key to, and it writes the information down and it puts it in that locker. And so and implicitly, by using your browser and allowing cookies, you say, yeah, you can do that. That's probably a good thing, because you want the website to know you've been there before, what you've done when you were there before. So in that locker, it records information about the current visit, and often it keeps that information so that it recognizes you when you come back. There also, so that's what's called a first-party cookie. There's also things that are called third-party cookies. So when I go to a website like Medline Plus, and I go on and I do a search, I know that I'm transacting with Medline Plus, and first-party cookies are information that Medline Plus stores for its own use about my activities on the site. But up in the right-hand side there might be an advertisement. That advertisement is put there by a third party. Sometimes there's not even an ad, there's just a third-party presence on the site, like Doubleclick. Doubleclick's present on the site as well, and Doubleclick, it turns out, also can see that I'm there, can see what I'm doing, and Doubleclick gets to store the information in its own special locker. So there's a Medline Plus locker about what, or WebMD locker about what I did, and there's a Doubleclick locker that information about that visit. Now the difference between those two kinds of information is huge, because WebMD only knows about my visits to WebMD, nothing else. Doubleclick, however, knows about my visits to any website where Doubleclick has a presence. So if I go from WebMD to some site where I'm going to purchase a blood glucose monitor, let's say, if Doubleclick has a presence on both sites, it gets to aggregate the information across them. So it knows that I was looking for information that was related to diabetes on WebMD. It knows now that I am looking for information about a blood glucose monitor on another site, and now it gets to put that together and understand more about who I am and what I'm doing. So that's a way in which we get tracked over time and across sites. That requires that my computer, my device, be complicit in this, be participatory. Cookies are stored on your device, and actually, shockingly, you have quite a bit of control over them. There's another kind of cookie, a special kind called flash cookie that they're developing now, that we have slightly less control over, but nonetheless, those two are stored on our devices. There's another kind of tracking that's becoming increasingly important that doesn't rely on participation of our devices, and one that we should be paying attention to. It's called device fingerprinting. So when you hit a website, that website can see all kinds of information it has to about your device, about the browser you're using, the size of your screen, in order to display the website appropriately, the content appropriately. It needs to know a lot about what's going on your device, and it turns out that if you put those things together, if you intersect them all, it turns out that it's a pretty unique profile Your device, it turns out, has a fingerprint. If you aggregate enough of these little bits of information about your device and how it's working, you can create what's called a device fingerprint, a unique profile of your device. Now, if the profile is unique, then the website, Amazon, can store information about your visit with that unique profile. It doesn't have to rely on you to store it in order to be able to link information from multiple visits. It can do the job because it says, here's my unique identifier, here's what happened yesterday. Oh, same unique identifier. I'm going to aggregate the information together. You have much less control over aggregation that's based on device fingerprinting. We don't have much choice. If we're going to participate in the online environment, we don't have much choice. We have some choice, but we don't have much choice about this kind of surveillance. It's going to happen around us, and I think what we need to think about is not so much how we stop it as how we live with it. So what do we do in order to live in an environment where governments, advertisers, other online entities are interested in knowing a lot about us and interested in an aggregated picture of who we are and what we do? It's of great value. One of the interesting things you can do is, I think it's Facebook that will provide this. Someone has a website where you can go online and you can basically find out what your profile is worth. See, it's worth a lot of money. That's where all those free services come from, right? It's worth a lot of money. The first thing you need to do is be aware. I'm telling you now, this tracking happens. It happens to you just as much as it happens to me. It happens to your kids, it happens to your parents, anybody who's online, and increasingly offline as well, is going to have this information collected about them. So you need to know that. One of the particular things you need to know, and this should come as no surprise, but somehow we've been seduced by it, is there is no such thing as a free service. There is a transaction happening here. If you're not paying in dollars and cents for the service that you're receiving, or you're not paying in service, you're not bartering service for a service that you're receiving, you're paying somehow. And in a large majority of cases, you're paying with your personal information. Good, bad, indifferent, just know that it's happening. There is a transaction, you're a party to that transaction, you can figure out what's going on in that transaction for the most part, if you read things like terms of service and privacy policies. But at the very least, understand you are transacting. You should therefore read your privacy policies and terms of service. If you're concerned about it, read them. Now, I have to say this with a caveat. They're very difficult to read. And a further caveat, which I think you'll see changing, given some directives, some changes in the policy that are being led out of the EU, where they're very interested in tracking, more responsive than we are. But in my review of privacy policies on consumer health information websites, what I find is that the collection of personally identifiable information is usually acknowledged in privacy policies. That's because there are strong regulatory requirements for this. But things are pretty spotty with respect to the acknowledging the collection and use of non-personally identifiable information through mechanisms like cookies, flash cookies, web beacons, or device fingerprinting. They don't always disclose this, and that's something you need to be aware of. You will see increasing disclosure because the regulatory frameworks are starting to respond, but you can't presume disclosure. So as much as possible, if there are many things that you do where it doesn't matter, I don't think being paranoid is ever going to help us. But if you are thinking that this information that I'm revealing, what I'm doing now is something that maybe I don't want aggregated into my profile, or I would like to know if this information is collected, then you need to use some tools that are at your disposal to find out what is being collected and how it's being used. And one of the primary things you need to do is to think about using privacy settings. Oftentimes we ignore these. Oftentimes privacy settings will default to visibility that's greater than what we know. So privacy settings on Facebook, for example, it's very important to pay attention to them, to understand who can see your profile and who can't, and to set those, and to create or to manipulate those settings so that they meet your privacy expectations and desires, and not so that they default to what Facebook decided you would want, which, they want to see your stuff. So you're going to use those privacy settings to both manage the visibility of your information, personal, identifiable, and to manage collection and storage of NPII. One of the first things you can do in any browser, you can go into privacy, and it will allow you to decide if you're going to let websites track you. You can turn that off. Tracking is the kind of thing I've been talking about. You can decide whether cookies are going to be allowed or not allowed. Typically, you can, from third parties. So these are the ones that are off the site that you are using. So this is from, I can't remember what browser I was using. But any browser you're using, website, Firefox, Safari, doesn't matter, will have a privacy settings. And take a look at it and see and decide. You can change your mind, too. Today, I don't want cookies. I don't want any information stored in cookies on my visits today. And tomorrow you can change it because there's value to that, right? There's value to you in having those cookies recorded. Things like passwords being filled in. That's great. That relies on a cookie. So just know. It's always a good idea to know when information is being collected. So I told you can't necessarily rely on the privacy policies and the terms of service. You should be able to rely on them, but you can't always rely on them. There are other ways of knowing. You can install plugins to browsers. A lot of the stuff I'm talking about today has to do with your use of browsers to go online. You can install plugins such as Ghostery or Disconnect or Abind. If you look any of those terms up online, you'll find them. They're small programs that you download and you connect to your browser. And when you do that, here's the websites for them. When you do that, they will, I should have taken a screenshot of it. If you install Ghostery, which slows down browsing for sure, that's a consequence, you get a little box up in the right-hand corner that says, okay, here's the entities that are collecting information about you right now. There'll be a list, and it's a surprisingly long list, actually. You'll be shocked. So you'll know who's collecting information. What you decide to do about it, again, is a choice, but you'll know. If this is a serious issue for you, then you can learn about anonymous browsers and things called virtual private networks. So there are ways to move around the internet without being tracked. They are costly in terms of time and effort, and costly in terms of functionality, so things don't go as well as you might want them to go. It's not as easy to use, but it's possible to do it. You'll have to be a little careful about legality of these because you can immediately see people, for legitimate reasons, might want to move around the net without being tracked, but of course, people who have criminal intentions would want to move around the net without being tracked. So in some cases, these approaches are not legal because the government, for security reasons, has an interest in ensuring that people with bad intentions don't do things online that are going to create problems. However, there are things like like search engines like Tor or DuckDuckGo, which are, so for the specific purpose of doing online searches, these two are search engines which do not allow tracking. So Google records every search you ever do, and you agree to this unless you go in and change the privacy settings, but surprisingly it defaults to you agreeing to this. Google knows a lot about you and who you are and what you're doing. If you use something like DuckDuckGo or Tor, they don't record that information. And I think it's really important for us all to recognize that the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, who actually funded this research, and the Privacy Commissioners of the provinces are there to protect us and or at least to respond to privacy concerns of Canadians. And really the function of that office is to protect our privacy rights. It doesn't mean that they're going to positively respond to every complaint that they get, but they will certainly pay attention to it. Companies also care. So companies do listen sometimes when users revolt. There was Instagram a very short time ago changed their terms of service such that they said that any photograph that was uploaded, they had the right to use that photograph in any way they wanted, including potentially for activities such as advertising. People revolted and said, absolutely no way, you're not going to do that. They went in and changed their terms of service. So Facebook has multiple times had this happen where people have gotten very upset when Facebook has changed their privacy policies or their privacy defaults, and Facebook has responded because, look, Facebook needs us as much as we need them. So if something's going on with a piece of software that you're using and you don't like it, complain about it. And if that doesn't work, complain to the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, the gentleman who was worried about the CPAP machine following him around the net, registered a complaint with the Privacy Commissioner of Canada and got some degree of satisfaction. Google will now pay attention to whether you're searching for CPAP. But there are other complaints that have come through about activities of online service providers, and the Privacy Commissioner of Canada has, in multiple cases, acted to restrict those. The bottom line, I think, is that it's your information and you need to take charge. You need to be aware that it's being collected. You need to be aware of what you're revealing about yourself. You need to be conscious of the decisions that you're making. That boils down to you need to recognize that you are making decisions, that we are participants, citizens, actors in this online environment, and it is our responsibility to be apprised of, sensitive to the contracts that we're negotiating and the deals that we're making as we move around online. So I want to thank you very much for coming today.